3 words, that's all it took. Layla stared at her phone, at the preview of a text from a number she didn't recognize. 3 words glowing against the screen at 6:47 in the morning. She looked at Stephen, at the man she'd married 5 years ago, at the man who'd held her hand at her father's funeral and whispered that he'd never let anything hurt her. 6 years she'd given him, and he'd spent them preparing her replacement. She slid out of bed without making a sound. But that's not where this really begins. To understand why Layla didn't wake him, didn't scream, didn't do any of the things a betrayed wife is supposed to do, you need to understand what she'd already survived and what she'd been quietly building while everyone thought she was broken. Her name was Layla Whitmore, 34 years old, chief strategist of the Whitmore Hospitality Group, a boutique hotel empire her father had built from a single inn in Charleston. Still married, at least on paper, but she understood now that she'd never really been a wife. She'd been an acquisition. 6 years earlier, Layla had been a different woman. She was 28 when her father died. Robert Whitmore, Bobby to everyone who knew him, had been the kind of man who remembered every housekeeper's birthday and still reviewed the guest comment cards himself every Sunday morning. He'd built the Whitmore Hospitality Group over 30 years, growing it from a single bed and breakfast on the Charleston waterfront to a collection of 12 boutique properties across the Southeast. Not the biggest chain, not the flashiest, but respected, profitable, and entirely his. When the heart attack took him, it took something from Layla, too. She'd been groomed to run the company since she was old enough to fold napkins in the dining room. She had the instincts, the education, the relationships. But grief has a way of making even the strongest people doubt themselves. And in those first months after the funeral, Layla doubted everything. That's when Margaret Thornton appeared. Margaret was old Charleston money. She'd known Bobby from the tourism board, from charity galas, from the small world where hospitality executives and real estate developers circled each other like sharks in evening wear. She arrived at Layla's door 3 weeks after the funeral with a casserole and condolences and a suggestion.
Her son, Stephen, was looking to transition out of commercial real estate in Atlanta. He understood the hospitality industry. He admired what Bobby had built, and he was, Margaret mentioned casually, recently single. Layla should have seen it then, the precision of the timing, the convenience of the introduction. But grief makes people hungry for comfort, and Stephen Thornton knew exactly how to provide it. He was 40 years old, tall, with the kind of confident ease that came from never having been told no. He didn't talk to Layla about her father's death the way everyone else did, with that careful, pitying tone that made her feel like a child. He talked to her about the company, about her vision for it, about the expansion opportunities she'd been sketching out for years but never had the chance to present to her father. He made her feel seen, capable, not like a grieving daughter, but like a businesswoman with a future. The first time he made her laugh, really laugh, the kind that surprised her because she'd forgotten she could, was at a dinner meeting 3 months after they'd met. They were reviewing a potential acquisition in Savannah, and he'd made some observation about the seller's terrible toupee that caught her off guard. She'd laughed so hard she'd snorted, and then immediately been mortified, and he'd just smiled at her like she was the most charming thing he'd ever seen. They were engaged within the year. Looking back, Layla could trace exactly how it happened, how Stephen positioned himself as indispensable, how Margaret became a constant presence at family dinners, company events, board meetings, how the suggestions started small. Maybe Stephen should sit in on the financial reviews just to offer a fresh perspective, and grew larger until suddenly he had an office at headquarters and a title she didn't remember approving. She'd been so focused on proving she could run her father's company that she hadn't noticed someone else was already running her. There was one person who tried to warn her. Her uncle, Richard Whitmore, had called after the engagement was announced. Richard was Bobby's older brother, a billionaire who'd made his fortune in Dallas real estate and energy while Bobby built his quieter empire in Charleston. The brothers had been close once, but something had driven them apart in their 40s, and by the time Bobby died, they hadn't spoken in years. Richard's call was brief. "Congratulations on the engagement," he'd said. Then a pause, and then, "Bobby always said you were the smart one. Make sure you stay that way." She'd dismissed it as the cryptic mutterings of an estranged uncle, but she'd never forgotten it.
Richard still held 15% of the Whitmore Hospitality Group, a stake he'd bought decades ago as a favor to his brother and never sold. He never attended board meetings, never interfered, just collected his dividends and watched from a distance. Layla had always wondered what he was watching for. Now, 6 years into a marriage that had slowly revealed itself to be a hostile takeover, she was beginning to understand. The signs had been there all along, if she'd known how to read them. The way Stephen always deferred to Margaret's opinion on social matters, the way he subtly redirected conversations away from Layla's strategic ideas and toward his own operational concerns, the way he'd positioned himself as the face of the company at industry events, while she stayed behind the scenes, focusing on the work. She'd thought she was being a team player. She'd thought they were building something together. She'd been wrong. The first time she truly saw Stephen for what he was, it was almost too late. A business dinner with potential partners from a hotel chain out of Miami. Layla had prepared for weeks, projections, market analysis, a proposal that would double the company's footprint in Florida within 3 years. But when the meeting started, Stephen took over. He presented her ideas as if they were his own. He fielded questions she should have answered. And when she tried to interject, he smiled at her, that same smile that had once made her feel safe, and said, "Let's not overwhelm them with details, sweetheart." Sweetheart, in a business meeting, in front of potential partners. The Miami executives had looked uncomfortable. One of them, a woman about Layla's age, had caught her eye with something like sympathy or recognition.
That night, Layla had lain awake in bed while Stephen snored beside her, and she'd finally allowed herself to ask the question she'd been avoiding for years. What if he never loved her? What if it was always about the company? She'd pushed the thought away then, but it had never really left. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10 at the end. Now let's continue. It started with the accounts. Stephen suggested they consolidate their finances about a year into the marriage. It made sense, he said. They were partners in life and business. Why maintain separate accounts when they were building something together? Layla agreed. She'd been raised to trust her husband. Her parents had shared everything: finances, decisions, the weight of building a company from nothing. She thought she was honoring that legacy. She didn't realize she was handing over the keys to her own cage. The changes were gradual. First, Stephen took over paying the household bills to free up her time for company strategy, he said. Then he suggested moving her personal savings into a joint investment account he'd set up with their financial advisor. Then her credit card started having issues, declined at a restaurant, flagged at a department store, always some technical glitch that Stephen would handle with a phone call and an apologetic smile. She didn't think to check the limits until she couldn't book a flight to visit an old college friend without asking Stephen to approve the charge. By then, she'd been married for 3 years. The company's finances were even more opaque. Stephen had positioned himself as the bridge between Layla's strategic vision and the operational reality. He attended every meeting with the CFO. He reviewed every capital allocation. He signed off on every major expense. When Layla asked to see the quarterly reports directly, he'd provide them, but always with his annotations, his summaries, his interpretation of what the numbers meant. Marcus Chen had worked for her father for 18 years. He was the comptroller, not the CFO, but the man who actually knew where every dollar went. He taught Layla to read a balance sheet when she was 16, and he was the first person to tell her something was wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late March. Stephen was in Atlanta for a conference. Marcus appeared at Layla's office door with a folder and a look she'd never seen on his face before. Concern, real concern. He didn't say much, just handed her the folder and told her to look at the disbursements from the past 18 months, specifically the ones routed through a subsidiary LLC that Stephen had created to manage renovation costs. The numbers didn't add up. Money was moving out of the company, significant amounts, 6 and 7 figures, into accounts that Marcus couldn't trace. The paperwork was immaculate. Every transfer had documentation, but the documentation led to shell companies, and the shell companies led to nothing. Someone was bleeding the company dry, and they were doing it carefully enough that only someone who'd spent 2 decades studying its financial heartbeat would notice. Layla looked at Marcus. He looked at her. Neither of them said Stephen's name. They didn't have to.
She didn't confront him, not yet. She needed to see how deep the hole went. The next few weeks, Layla played the role of the oblivious wife. She smiled at Stephen across the breakfast table. She asked about his day. She let him kiss her forehead before bed as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Marcus started bringing her files every Thursday afternoon when Stephen was reliably occupied with his investment meetings in Atlanta. The picture that emerged was worse than Layla had imagined. Stephen wasn't just skimming, he was systematically extracting capital from every part of the company he could access. There was a renovation fund for the Charleston flagship property, $2 million approved by the board for upgrades that had never been completed. The contractors had been paid according to the paperwork, but Marcus had called them. Most had never heard of the project.
There was a consulting retainer paid to a firm in Nevada that didn't appear to have any employees, any office, or any record of providing actual consulting services. $75,000 a month going back 14 months. And then there was the Arizona LLC. Marcus had finally traced the ownership, layer after layer of corporate shell games, but he'd found the thread and followed it. The LLC owned a single asset, a property in Sedona valued at just over $4 million, a boutique wellness retreat that was scheduled to open in the spring. The property was titled to Ann Martinez. The funding had come from Stephen's shell companies, and the business plan Marcus had obtained showed projections for the next 5 years, projections that assumed a significant capital injection right around the time Stephen's divorce from Layla was expected to finalize. He wasn't just cheating on her. He was using her father's company to finance his future with another woman. What happened next would change everything. Margaret was the architect of Layla's social exile. It wasn't obvious at first. Margaret was always so helpful, so present. She organized the dinner parties, managed the guest lists, handled the RSVPs. She was just trying to take things off Layla's plate, she said, give her more time to focus on the business. But Layla started noticing patterns. Old friends stopped being invited to events. Colleagues who'd known her father were quietly shuffled to the edges of conversations. Board members who'd once sought her opinion now directed their questions to Stephen, while Margaret hovered nearby with that thin smile that never reached her eyes. The charity gala for the Charleston Children's Hospital was the night Layla understood what was happening. She'd been on the planning committee for 5 years. It was one of her mother's causes before she passed, and Layla had continued it in her memory. But this year, she arrived at the venue to find her seat had been moved. She was no longer at the head table with the major donors. She was tucked in a corner, next to the emergency exit, with a clear view of Margaret holding court where Layla should have been.
When she asked about the change, the event coordinator looked confused. Mrs. Thornton said you preferred to be out of the spotlight this year. Something about the stress of the company restructuring. Layla hadn't said anything of the sort, and there was no restructuring. Not yet, anyway. Her friend Diane tried to warn her. They'd known each other since graduate school, and Diane had never liked Stephen. Too polished, she said. Too eager to agree with everything Layla said. They met for lunch at a cafe outside the city, away from Margaret's network of eyes and ears. Diane told her what she'd heard through the Charleston rumor mill. That Stephen was telling people Layla was struggling, that the stress of running her father's company was taking a toll, that she was becoming erratic, paranoid. Layla drove home in a daze. That night, Stephen found her sitting in the dark in the living room. He asked what was wrong. She told him about the lunch with Diane, about the rumors. He didn't get defensive, didn't raise his voice. He just sat down across from her and spoke in that calm, reasonable tone he always used when he wanted her to feel like she was overreacting. Diane had always been jealous of Layla's success, he said. She was probably just stirring up drama because her own marriage was falling apart. And as for the rumors, well, people talked. That was just how Charleston society worked. The best thing Layla could do was ignore it, focus on her work, let him handle the social side. He was building walls around her, and he thought she was letting him. The isolation extended beyond social events. Layla started noticing how her phone seemed to lose messages. Important emails went to spam. Meeting invitations arrived after the meetings had already happened. Stephen always had an explanation. Technology was unreliable. People were forgetful. Layla was probably just stressed and missing things. But she wasn't missing things. She was finally seeing them. There was a pattern to who got pushed out of her life. Anyone who might question Stephen's version of events. Anyone who remembered her as the competent, confident woman she'd been before her father died. Anyone who might notice that the Layla who existed now, quiet, deferential, always a step behind her husband, wasn't the real Layla at all.
She tested it one afternoon, sent an email to 3 board members requesting individual meetings to discuss strategic planning. Nothing controversial, nothing that should raise any alarms. None of them responded directly. Instead, Stephen mentioned casually at dinner that he'd heard she was reaching out to board members and wondered if everything was okay. He suggested maybe he should handle board communications for a while, just until things settled down. She agreed, of course. She was always agreeing now. It was part of the plan. But that night, she added their names to a list. Board members who reported to Stephen instead of responding to her. People she'd need to work around when the time came. The trap was closing, but for the first time in years, Layla knew exactly where the walls were. That knowledge would cost him everything. She found the first evidence on a Tuesday in September. Stephen had left his tablet on the kitchen counter. He never did that. He was careful with his devices, always locking screens, always logging out, always making sure nothing was left where Layla might accidentally see it. But that morning he'd been in a rush. A conference call with investors in New York had started earlier than expected, and he'd grabbed his laptop and sprinted to his office without his usual security sweep. The tablet pinged with a notification. Layla glanced at it. She wasn't looking for anything. She was just reaching for her coffee, and the screen lit up, and there it was. A message from someone named Anne. The preview showed only the first few words. "I can't stop thinking about last weekend." For a moment, Layla didn't move. She just stood there, coffee cup halfway to her lips, staring at the screen. The words seemed to rearrange themselves as she read them. Surely they meant something else. Surely there was an explanation. She set down the coffee. She picked up the tablet. She swiped. The passcode screen appeared. 4 digits. She tried Stephen's birthday. Wrong. His mother's birthday. Wrong. Their anniversary. Wrong. She tried the date of her father's death. The tablet unlocked. The messages went back 7 months. They weren't explicit, nothing that would hold up in a divorce proceeding as proof of infidelity, but they were worse than explicit. They were intimate. Anne talked about the future, about when things are settled, about our plans. She mentioned a property in Sedona, a boutique wellness retreat she was developing. She thanked Stephen for believing in her vision, for his investment, for everything he was making possible. Layla scrolled through the messages with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a wound. She didn't cry, she didn't break anything. She just read and cataloged and understood. Anne Martinez, 31 years old, former hospitality manager who'd somehow acquired enough capital to purchase a luxury property in one of Arizona's most expensive markets. The funding had come from somewhere, and now Layla knew where. She put the tablet back exactly where she'd found it. She finished her coffee. She went to work. She didn't tell Stephen what she'd seen. Not yet. That's when Layla understood. She wasn't being cheated on. She was being phased out. She spent the next week learning everything she could about Anne Martinez. Social media told part of the story. Anne was careful about what she posted, but not careful enough. There were photos from industry conferences where Stephen had also been present. A tagged location at a resort in Cabo San Lucas from a weekend Stephen had claimed to be in Houston. A congratulatory comment from Margaret, who supposedly didn't know this woman existed, on a post about Anne's exciting new venture. The hospitality world was smaller than people realized. Layla made a few careful inquiries through contacts who owed her father favors. Anne had worked for a competitor chain in Phoenix before striking out on her own. She was smart, ambitious, good at her job. She was also apparently good at stealing other women's husbands. But there was something else Layla discovered, something that reframed everything she thought she knew about Anne's successful entrepreneurship.
Anne Martinez had declared bankruptcy 3 years ago. Her credit had been destroyed. There was no way she could have secured financing for a $4 million property through any legitimate channel. The money had to come from somewhere, and now Layla knew exactly where. Stephen had taken the capital he was bleeding from the Whitmore Hospitality Group and invested it in his mistress's dream. He'd used Layla's inheritance to build a future with another woman. Every dollar that went missing from the company was a dollar that went toward a property that would belong to Anne, a property titled in her name, protected from any divorce proceedings, funded entirely with stolen money. The cruelty of it took Layla's breath away, but the stupidity of it gave her hope. Stephen had created a paper trail. He'd been careful, but not careful enough. The same documents that proved his theft would prove Anne's involvement, and that meant leverage. She didn't know it yet, but someone was watching. The medical invoice arrived in October. It was buried in a stack of statements that Stephen usually intercepted, but the mail had come early that day, and Layla happened to be home. A routine ultrasound at a women's clinic in Scottsdale, Arizona, billed to a credit card she didn't recognize, but linked to an address she now knew very well. Anne was pregnant. The timeline was simple arithmetic. 4 months along meant conception in June. June, when Stephen had spent 2 weeks in Phoenix for what he'd called exploratory meetings with Southwest expansion partners. June, when Layla had been recovering from a procedure that had ended her own chances of having a child that year. He'd told her it wasn't the right time. The company was at a critical juncture. They needed to focus on the business. They could try again next year. While she was healing, he was starting a family with another woman. Marcus brought her more information the following week. He'd been digging carefully, covering his tracks, but he'd found something that made even his experienced face go pale.
Stephen had hired a divorce attorney. Not just any divorce attorney, Helen Marchetti, known in Charleston legal circles as the Surgeon, for her ability to separate wealthy men from their equally wealthy wives with minimal collateral damage, to the men anyway. The strategy documents Marcus had obtained, Layla didn't ask how, painted a clear picture. Stephen was preparing to file for divorce, but he wasn't planning to leave empty-handed. The documents outlined a narrative. Layla had become increasingly unstable since her father's death. The stress of running the company had taken a toll on her mental health. She'd made erratic business decisions. She'd become paranoid, accusing her husband of imaginary betrayals. There were witness statements, colleagues who would testify to her concerning behavior, board members who had reservations about her leadership. And at the center of it all, Margaret, who would tearfully confirm that she'd watched her daughter-in-law's mental state deteriorate over the years. The goal was clear, not just to divorce Layla, but to declare her unfit to manage her own inheritance, to take her removed from the board of her father's company, to take everything Bobby Whitmore had built and hand it to a man who spent 6 years pretending to be a partner while positioning himself as a parasite. Layla read the documents twice. Then she put them in her safe, and then she started making her own plans. They thought she was drowning. They didn't realize she was learning to breathe underwater. The scope of Stephen's plan became clearer with each document Marcus uncovered. The divorce strategy was elaborate. Helen Marchetti, the attorney Stephen had hired, specialized in what she delicately called complex asset restructuring. In practice, this meant helping wealthy clients separate from their spouses while keeping as much money on their side of the ledger. The approach in Layla's case was particularly vicious. Step 1. Establish a narrative of mental instability. This had been building for years, Layla now realized. Every time Stephen expressed concern about her stress levels, every time Margaret suggested she'd take some time off, every dinner party where she'd been quietly excluded from business conversations.
It was all building towards a portrait of a woman who couldn't handle her responsibilities. Step 2. Document erratic behavior. Layla found records of incidents she'd barely remembered, a disagreement with a vendor that Stephen had characterized as aggressive in an email to the board, a missed meeting that she was certain she'd never been told about, a purchase on her credit card for luxury items that turned out to be a donation to her mother's favorite charity. Each incident was minor on its own. Together, they painted a picture. Step 3. Secure sympathetic witnesses. The list made Layla's stomach turn. Board members she'd considered allies, colleagues she'd trusted, even her own housekeeper who'd apparently been providing Margaret with weekly reports on Layla's state of mind. Step 4. Move assets beyond reach. This was where the shell companies came in. By the time the divorce was filed, Stephen expected most of the company's liquid capital to be safely tucked away in accounts Layla couldn't touch. The property in Sedona was just the beginning. The final step was the most elegant: position for control. Once Layla was declared unfit to manage her inheritance, someone would need to step in,
someone with experience, someone the board trusted, someone who'd been quietly positioning himself as the steady hand during his wife's difficult period. Stephen would divorce Layla, take her money, and inherit her father's company in the same set of legal maneuvers. It was almost impressive in a sociopathic kind of way. But Stephen had made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated his wife. Layla read through the documents one more time. Then she started making her own list, not of grievances or evidence or plans for confrontation, just a list of people. People who owed her father, people who remembered what loyalty meant, people who would help her when the time came. The worst part? This was only the beginning. The board meeting in early December should have been routine. Quarterly review, budget projections, the usual parade of PowerPoints and financial forecasts that Layla had sat through dozens of times before. But from the moment she walked into the conference room, she knew something was different.
Stephen was already there, which wasn't unusual, but so was Margaret, which was, and so were three men Layla didn't recognize, sitting at the far end of the table in matching charcoal suits. Attorneys, she could smell it on them. Stephen smiled when she entered, that easy, confident smile that used to make her feel safe. Now it made her skin crawl. "Layla," he said, as if they were meeting at a cocktail party, "I'm glad you're here. We have some things to discuss." The meeting wasn't about quarterly numbers. It was about restructuring. Stephen had prepared a presentation, professional slides, detailed organizational charts, a new vision for the Whitmore Hospitality Group that positioned him as CEO and Layla as nothing. Her title would be Strategic Advisor, an honorary position. No operational authority, no financial oversight, no seat at the table where decisions were actually made. The board members watched her as Stephen spoke. Some of them couldn't meet her eyes. Others studied her with the careful attention of people who'd already made their minds and were just waiting to see if she'd make a scene. She didn't. She sat in silence as her father's company was redrawn with her on the outside. She listened as Stephen explained that this was best for everyone and that Layla could focus on her health and that the company needed steady leadership during this transitional period. Margaret smiled from the corner of the room. Not a triumphant smile. She was too smart for that. Just a small, satisfied curve of the lips, the smile of a woman watching a plan come together. When the vote was called, it wasn't even close. Layla walked out of that conference room with nothing. No title, no authority, no power to stop what was happening to everything her father had built. Stephen caught up with her in the parking lot, tried to take her hand, told her this was really for the best, and that once things settled down, they could figure out their next chapter. She pulled her hand away without a word. That night, she found Margaret in our home, directing the housekeeper on which rooms to prepare for the transition. The older woman spoke about Layla's future living arrangements as if she were discussing furniture placement.
A smaller place would be more manageable. Something in the suburbs, perhaps, away from the stress of the city. Stephen arrived home to find them together. For the first time since their marriage, he didn't bother pretending. He talked about the divorce as a settled matter, about the paperwork that was already being drawn up, about how this would all be easier if Layla simply cooperated. She said nothing. She nodded in the right places. She let her shoulders slump and her eyes drop and her voice fade to a whisper. And when she finally climbed the stairs to the bedroom that would soon no longer be hers, Stephen and Margaret exchanged looks of relief. The difficult part was over. The widow's daughter had finally accepted her fate. They didn't see her face once she turned away. He saw surrender. He should have seen the calm before the storm. The next morning, Layla woke early. She stood at the window of what would soon be someone else's bedroom and watched the sun rise over Charleston. The city looked the same as it always had, cobblestone streets and historic facades, and tourists already lining up for breakfast at the waterfront cafes. Her father had loved this view. He'd stood at this same window when she was a child, pointing out the different boats in the harbor, telling her stories about the guests at his first little inn. "This city gave us everything," he'd said once. "We owe it our best work." She wondered what he'd think of what she was about to do. Stephen found her there an hour later. He'd slept well, the sleep of a man who believed his problems were solved. He came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, a gesture that once would have felt like comfort and now felt like a warning. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep. Thinking about the transition?" She nodded, let him see what he wanted to see. "It's for the best," he said, and there was something almost like genuine belief in his voice. "You've been carrying too much for too long. Your father would want you to take care of yourself." Layla didn't trust herself to respond to that. She just nodded again.
Stephen kissed her top of the head and went to shower. A few minutes later, she heard him on the phone with someone, Margaret probably, or Anne, or one of his attorneys, making plans for the future he thought was already his. She stayed at the window until he left for the office. Then she picked up her own phone and made a call. "It's time," she said. On the other end of the line, Richard Whitmore started to laugh. The team came together in pieces. First was Marcus, the comptroller who'd spent 18 years protecting her father's legacy and was now protecting hers. He worked at night, after the offices emptied, documenting every irregular transfer, every shell company, every dollar Stephen had siphoned from the Whitmore accounts. The paper trail was meticulous. Stephen had been careful, but not careful enough. Second was Elena Vasquez. Layla had found her through a contact at the Charleston County Bar, a family law attorney with a specialty in high net worth divorces and corporate asset protection. Elena had seen cases like this before. Wealthy husbands who thought they could manipulate the system, wives who were supposed to disappear quietly. She took one look at Layla's situation and smiled the smile of a woman who enjoyed her work. Third, and most important, was a phone call to Dallas. Richard Whitmore answered on the second ring. Layla hadn't spoken to her uncle in years, not since that brief congratulations call after her engagement with his cryptic warning about staying smart. But she remembered his voice, calm, patient, the voice of a man who'd spent 50 years building an empire by knowing when to wait and when to strike. She didn't ask for help. That wasn't how Richard operated, and she knew it. Instead, she presented him with an opportunity. The Whitmore Hospitality Group was undervalued. Stephen's mismanagement had suppressed the stock price. The properties were solid, the brand was respected, but the financials were a mess that only someone like Marcus could fully untangle. For a man like Richard, with his billions in Dallas real estate, his connections across the Southwest, it was a chance to acquire a significant stake in a company with real growth potential at a steep discount. All she needed was for him to buy her shares. Not all of them, just 20%, enough to combine with the 15% he already held and create a new controlling interest, enough to call a special board meeting, enough to undo everything Stephen had spent 6 years building. The line was silent for a long moment after she finished her pitch. "Bobby always said you were the smart one," Richard finally said. "I'm starting to think he underestimated you." The papers were signed in Dallas 3 days later. Layla told no one, not Marcus, not Elena, not anyone who might accidentally let something slip. She flew to Texas on a commercial flight, coach class, paying cash for her ticket. She met Richard in his office overlooking the Dallas skyline and signed documents that transferred 20% of her inheritance to a man she barely knew and trusted completely. When she flew back to Charleston that night, her phone showed 6 missed calls from Stephen. He was checking in, he said in the voicemails, making sure she was okay, wondering where she was. She didn't call back. The next week passed in a strange kind of peace. Stephen was busy with the transition. Margaret was busy redecorating the executive offices. The board members who'd voted against Layla were busy pretending they had no choice. None of them noticed that Marcus had stopped coming to the financial review meetings. None of them noticed that Elena Vasquez had filed a motion in family court, sealed by the judge until the appropriate time. None of them noticed that Richard Whitmore had requested a special session of the board of directors, citing his rights as a major shareholder to review concerns about corporate governance. Layla moved through those days like a ghost. She smiled when expected. She agreed when prompted. She let Stephen believe he'd won. But at night, when the house was quiet and Stephen was asleep with his phone face down on the nightstand, she sat in the dark and reviewed the timeline. December 15th. That was the date. The date Richard's board request would be processed. The date Elena's motion would be unsealed. The date everything would change. She looked at the ceiling of the bedroom she'd shared with this man for 6 years, counted the days, and waited. Stephen thought he was removing her from the board. He didn't know she'd already sold him off it. The final piece came together in a conference room in Dallas, 3 days before the board meeting that would change everything. Layla sat across from her uncle, the documents spread between them. 20% of her birthright signed away to a man she'd met maybe half a dozen times in her entire life. It should have felt like loss, like giving up,
Instead, it felt like loading a weapon. Richard reviewed the paperwork with the careful attention of a man who'd spent 50 years making deals that shaped cities. He didn't rush, didn't make small talk, just read every clause, every provision, every carefully worded contingency. Finally, he looked up. "Your father would be proud," he said. "This is exactly what he would have done." "I don't know about that." Layla's voice was steady, but something in her chest ached. "Dad trusted people. That's why he let Stephen in." "Bobby trusted you," Richard corrected. "He trusted you to protect what he built, and that's exactly what you're doing." He signed the documents. Layla signed after him, and just like that, the balance of power shifted. But they weren't done yet. The next 2 days were a careful choreography of preparation. Elena Vasquez filed her motion with the family court, requesting an emergency freeze on marital assets pending investigation of financial misconduct. The motion was sealed. No one would know about it until the judge unsealed it at 9 a.m. on December 15th, exactly 1 hour before the board meeting was scheduled to begin. Marcus prepared a comprehensive report on Stephen's financial irregularities. Every shell company, every diverted dollar, every payment to Ann Martinez's wellness retreat. The report was damning, meticulous, and irrefutable. Richard's team prepared the shareholder notification. As the owner of 35% of the Whitmore Hospitality Group, he had the right to request a special session to address governance concerns. The notification went out at 6 a.m. on December 15th, giving Stephen approximately 4 hours to panic before he had to face the consequences. Layla prepared herself.
She sat in her Dallas hotel room the night before, watching the lights of the city spread out below her like a constellation. Somewhere in Charleston, Stephen was probably sleeping soundly, dreaming of the empire he was about to inherit. Margaret was probably reviewing her guest list for the celebration dinner she'd already planned. Anne was probably decorating a nursery, planning a future that depended on stolen money. None of them knew what was coming. Lila's phone buzzed. A text from Stephen. "Missing you. Can't wait to start our new chapter together." She stared at the message for a long moment. Then she typed a reply. "Me too." She sent it. Then she turned off her phone, ordered room service, and went to bed. Tomorrow, everything would change. December 15th arrived, cold and gray, with the threat of rain hanging over Charleston like a held breath. The board meeting was scheduled at 10 a.m. in the main conference room at Whitmore headquarters. Stephen had asked Layla to attend, though she no longer had voting rights. A gesture of goodwill, he'd said, a chance to be part of the company's new chapter. She'd agreed, but she wasn't in Charleston at 10 a.m. She was in Dallas, sitting in Richard's office with a video feed of the conference room on a screen in front of her, watching. The board members filed in one by one. Stephen took his seat at the head of the table, her father's seat, the one Bobby had occupied for 3 decades. Margaret sat against the wall, where she always did, pretending to be an observer while pulling every string in sight. The attorneys in their charcoal suits were there too, ready to finalize whatever documents needed finalizing, ready to make Stephen's control permanent. At 10:05, the conference room door opened. Richard Whitmore walked in. Layla watched Stephen's face on the screen, watched the confusion ripple across his features, followed by something that looked almost like fear. Richard had never attended a board meeting, not once in 30 years. His presence meant something was wrong. "I apologize for the intrusion," Richard said, his Texas drawl filling the room. "But I've recently acquired a significant interest in this company, and I have some concerns I'd like to address." He produced a folder, thick, heavy with documentation. The next 45 minutes were a masterclass in corporate demolition. Richard laid out everything: the shell companies, the diverted funds, the LLC in Arizona that had received over $3 million in unauthorized transfers, the same LLC that owned a boutique wellness retreat in Sedona, a retreat operated by a woman named Ann Martinez, a woman who, Richard noted with devastating understatement, was expecting Stephen's child. The board members' faces transformed as they listened. Confusion gave way to shock. Shock gave way to anger. Several of them turned to look at Stephen, but he wasn't looking back. He was staring at the table, at the folder, at the evidence of his own destruction. Margaret tried to intervene. She stood up, her voice sharp, demanding to know what right Richard had to make these accusations, but Richard just smiled and produced another document. As of this morning, he said, I hold 35% of the Whitmore Hospitality Group. Combined with the 30% still held by my niece, Layla, that gives us controlling interest, and we'd like to propose some changes to the board's composition. Stephen finally looked up. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. Layla sold you her shares? His voice cracked on her name. Not all of them. Richard's smile didn't waver. Just enough. Stephen tried to speak, to argue, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but every face he met looked away. Margaret stood up, her voice sharp, commanding, the voice of a woman who'd spent decades bending Charleston society to her will. This is absurd, she said. You can't just walk in here and— I can, Richard interrupted, his voice mild but his eyes cold. I'm a 35% shareholder, and I have concerns about how this company has been managed. He produced another folder. This one was thicker than the first. Financial records, bank statements, wire transfers, a paper trail that led from the Whitmore Hospitality Group's accounts through a maze of shell companies and ended at a boutique wellness retreat in Sedona, Arizona. These documents show systematic asset diversion over the past 3 years, approximately $4.2 million transferred to entities controlled by Mr. Thornton and subsequently invested in a property owned by his associate, Ms. Ann Martinez. The room was silent. Stephen's face had gone from pale to gray. Furthermore, Richard said, I have documentation suggesting that Mr.
Thornton has been preparing to file for divorce from my niece while simultaneously positioning himself to assume control of this company. The strategy involved characterizing Mrs. Thornton as mentally unfit to manage her inheritance. He looked directly at Margaret. A strategy that appears to have been developed with significant input from Mr. Thornton's mother. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The vote was swift. Stephen was removed from his operational role immediately, pending a full investigation into financial irregularities. His shares, the 8% he'd accumulated through the complicated vesting agreement he'd signed 6 years ago without reading carefully, were frozen. His access to company accounts was terminated before the meeting even ended. He tried to call Layla. She watched him do it on the video feed. Watched him pull out his phone and dial, his fingers clumsy with panic. Her phone was on Richard's desk, face up. Stephen's name flashed on the screen. She didn't answer. He called again, and again, and again. Each missed call was a small victory. Each ignored voicemail was a brick in the wall she was building between her past and her future. By the time the board meeting adjourned, he'd called 11 times. The calls kept coming throughout the day. Stephen left voicemails that started confused and grew increasingly desperate. He needed to talk to her. There had been a misunderstanding. If she would just let him explain. At 2:47 p.m., Elena Vasquez's motion was unsealed. Stephen's assets were frozen pending investigation. His credit card stopped working. His access to the joint accounts was revoked. Everything he'd stolen, everything he'd hidden, everything he'd thought was safely beyond Layla's reach, all of it was suddenly locked away. He called 12 more times between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. By the time he realized Layla wasn't coming back to Charleston, he'd called 23 times. The 24th call was different. His voice had changed. The confusion was gone. The desperation was gone. What remained was something smaller, something broken. I know you're not going to answer, he said to her voicemail. I know I don't deserve an answer. But Layla, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't expect you to believe that. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know.
She listened to the voicemail on speaker, sitting in Richard's office with the Dallas skyline glittering behind her. When it ended, she deleted it. Then she went to dinner with her uncle and ordered the most expensive wine on the menu. By the time she went to bed that night, Stephen had called 30 times. She didn't answer any of them. Stephen drove to Sedona 3 days later. The retreat looked different in December. The desert landscape was muted, browns and tans under a pale winter sky. The property itself was beautiful and had good taste, Layla had to admit. clean lines and natural materials and huge windows that framed the red rocks in the distance. Stephen had paid for every bit of it, with money he'd stolen from his wife. Anne met him at the door of the retreat, the property he'd funded with money stolen from his wife. She was showing now, her pregnancy visible beneath the flowing linen of her Arizona wardrobe. She looked at him without surprise. She'd been expecting this visit. "I saw the news," she said. There wasn't sympathy in her voice, wasn't warmth, just the flat acknowledgement of a fact she'd already processed. Stephen had practiced what he was going to say on the drive from the airport. He'd rehearsed his explanation, his apology, his plan for their future. He and Anne could still make this work. The retreat was in her name. The money was already invested. They could build something here, away from Charleston, away from the wreckage of his old life. But standing in front of her, the words dissolved. He asked if he could stay, just for a while, just until he figured things out. Anne's answer was quiet but firm. She appreciated everything he'd done for her business. She was grateful for his support during the pregnancy. But she'd built this life for herself and her daughter. She wasn't interested in building it with a man who'd just lost everything. "I never," Stephen started. "You embezzled from your wife's company to fund my business. You told me the money was clean. You told me it was from investments you'd made before your marriage. You lied to me, Stephen, just like you lied to her."
Anne, I'm keeping the property. I earned it, even if the seed money was dirty. And I'm keeping our daughter. She put a hand on her belly. But I'm not keeping you. Stephen stood in the doorway of the beautiful retreat he'd paid for and watched the mother of his child close the door in his face. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 6 years building a trap for Layla. In the end, he'd only caught himself. He'd spent years building an exit. He just didn't realize it was his own. Spring came early to Charleston that year. Layla stood at the window of her office, her father's old office, restored to its original arrangement, and watched the first boats of the tourist season making their way across the harbor. The city was waking up. The hotels were filling. The company was healing. The investigation into Stephen's financial misconduct had concluded in February. The total amount diverted exceeded $4 million. Criminal charges were still pending, though the forensic accountants suggested it would be difficult to prove intent beyond civil liability. He'd been careful, just not careful enough. Marcus had received a promotion, Chief Financial Officer, a title that came with a corner office and a salary increase that made him blush when Layla told him. He'd earned it. Without his 18 years of quiet vigilance, none of this would have been possible. Elena Vasquez had become something like a friend. They had lunch once a month now, not to discuss legal strategy, but just to talk. Elena had a dark sense of humor and a wine collection that rivaled some of the Whitmore properties' cellars. She'd also introduced Layla to a network of women who'd been through similar experiences, survivors, rebuilders, women who understood what it meant to lose everything and choose to keep going anyway. Richard had remained as chairman, but it was Layla who ran the company now, CEO of the Whitmore Hospitality Group, a title her father had always assumed she'd hold someday. She'd expanded into wellness tourism, a market she'd been researching for years, waiting for the right moment. The first acquisition was a boutique property in Sedona. Anne had sold her a minority stake in the retreat, a business decision they'd both agreed, nothing personal.
The property was performing well, and partnering with an established hospitality brand made sense for its growth trajectory. Anne remained as general manager. They communicated through lawyers and spreadsheets, and that suited them both fine. There was a certain poetry to it. The retreat that Stephen had funded with stolen money was now partially owned by the woman he'd stolen from. Every quarterly profit report was a small reminder of how thoroughly his plan had failed. Stephen had returned to Charleston briefly to collect his belongings and finalize the divorce. He was thinner than Layla remembered, quieter. The confidence that had once drawn her to him was gone, replaced by something smaller and more desperate. He'd asked to meet, to talk, to explain. She'd declined. The last time she saw him was at the lawyer's office for the final signing. He'd tried to catch her eye across the conference table, tried to communicate something. Remorse, maybe, or the ghost of affection. She'd kept her gaze on the documents. When the divorce was final, she'd walked out of that office without looking back. He was working with Margaret now. They'd opened a small bed and breakfast in Savannah. Nothing like the empire he'd almost controlled, but enough to keep the lights on. Margaret's connections in the old Southern hospitality circles had gotten them started, but those connections were fraying. Word had spread about what Stephen had done. The industry was smaller than people realized, and it had a long memory.
The bed and breakfast had 8 rooms. The Whitmore Hospitality Group had 12 properties and was in negotiations for 3 more. The contrast spoke for itself. His daughter was born in April, Olivia Ann Martinez. Stephen drove to Sedona for the birth and stayed for 3 days. He had visitation rights, negotiated by lawyers, documented in court orders. He was allowed to be part of his daughter's life, just not the way he'd imagined. Layla learned about the birth through a news alert on her phone. She looked at the notification for a long moment, then swiped it away and returned to her work.
Some mornings she still thought about those 3 words on the screen. She's having it. The message that had started everything. The moment her old life ended and her new one began. She didn't regret any of it. Not the pain of discovery, not the months of careful planning, not the choice to fight instead of flee. Her father had taught her that the hospitality business was about more than hotels. It was about understanding what people needed before they knew they needed it. Stephen had needed to believe she was weak. She'd given him exactly what he needed. Now she was giving herself what she deserved. Her phone buzzed, a text from Marcus confirming the quarterly numbers, revenue up, occupancy strong, the new Sedona partnership exceeding projections. Another text from Richard, just a photo of the Dallas skyline at sunset with the caption, "Not a bad view from where I'm sitting." She smiled, typed a quick reply, then turned back to the window. The harbor was full now, boats cutting white lines through the blue water. Somewhere out there, her father had dreamed of building something that would last, something that would matter, something that would take care of the people who depended on it. She was still building it. Her phone lit up one more time, a message from a blocked number. She glanced at it without opening. Stephen, still trying, still hoping, still believing that somewhere inside her there was still the grieving woman he'd met at her father's funeral, the woman who'd needed someone to take care of her. That woman was gone. She'd been replaced by someone stronger, someone sharper, someone who'd learned that the most dangerous thing a person can do is underestimate a woman who's already lost everything she thought she needed. Layla deleted the message without reading it and went back to work. Some women wait for the storm to pass. Layla learned to reroute the weather. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories. See you next time.